Welcome to On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine, a show where we report, rebel, and tell it like it is. On this show, we center your concerns about rebuilding our nation and advancing the promise of equality. Join me as we tackle the most compelling issues of our times. On our show, History Matters, we examine the past as we pivot to the future. On today's show, we focus on the year in review and looking ahead to 2021 and beyond. This year has been defined by the COVID-19 pandemic, a reckoning on racism and policing in the United States, the 2020 election, and the ongoing fight for justice. So, what does the 2020 election and the Biden-Harris win mean for our democracy? How important is the outcome of the Georgia runoff for the Biden-Harris administration and for our nation? How are we going to address the legitimacy question of our United States Supreme Court, and what hope lies ahead in the realm of reproductive health rights and justice? Now, helping us to sort out those questions and so many more are really important guests. So I'm joined by Russ Feingold. He is the president of the American Constitution Society. Russ served as a United States Senator from Wisconsin and also a Wisconsin State Senator. He's the author of While America Sleeps, a wake-up call for the post-9/11 era. I'm also joined by Deidre Fishel. She is an award-winning filmmaker. Her films have been broadcast in 35 countries worldwide. She just finished Women in Blue, a feature documentary that follows women officers of the Minneapolis Police Department and explores the intersections of race, gender, power, and violence in American policing. This film will broadcast on PBS on February 8th, 2021. I'm also joined by Stephen Vladeck. He is the A. Dalton Cross Professor in Law at the University of Texas School of Law. He's a nationally recognized expert on federal courts, constitutional law, national security law, and so much more. He's argued before the United States Supreme Court, the Texas Supreme Court, lower federal courts. You've also seen him on CNN, and you've probably heard him on his award-winning and very popular podcast, National Security Law Podcast. And last but not least, I am joined by Andrea Young. She is the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Georgia. She is also the former vice president for external affairs for Planned Parenthood of Metropolitan Washington, and she served as vice president of the National Black Child Development Institute. Welcome to our Ms. Magazine show. Thank you all for joining us to discuss these very important issues as we wrap up 2020. I want to start off our end of the year show with the tragedy of the death of George Floyd, which actually came after Breonna Taylor's death, and turn to you, Deidre, to tell us a bit about the film that you made, Women in Blue, and the backdrop for it, because it takes place in Minneapolis. And who could predict that when you decided to do a film on policing, that we would be in the space that we've been in 2020?
Well, ironically, or not so tragically, I should say, I got interested in the film because of Eric Garner's killing by the NYPD, and it seems such violence, and it's sort of incomprehensible. So I had a friend who was a woman cop, and I asked her if it could have happened on her watch. And it wasn't just that she said, no, it couldn't have. It was that she said, I just would have started and said, hey, my name is Sally, what's your name? And I kept just sort of thinking about that sort of human, just kind of a certain approach. And that led me into some research that showed that there's been evidence since the 1990s that was done after the Rodney King beating by the Christopher Commission in California, that women officers do communicate better, and that because of that, they tend to slow things down, and that they do use less force. And there was kind of a movement in the 90s with community policing to get more women into police forces. And then 9/11 happened. And there was really just this push towards militarization. And so I felt that was something. Why wasn't anybody talking about women and what they could potentially bring given the level of police violence that we've had in this country? And that led me to Minneapolis. And I went there primarily because there was a woman chief who was trying to reform the department. And it was tough going, but she did see bringing women as part of the solution.
And she's a woman of color too, right?
Yes, she is a Native American woman. And, 3 months after I got there, there was a very tragic and high profile shooting, this time of a white woman, a white Australian woman by a black officer. And
And
those
Chief Arnaud was fired.
and she was fired rapidly. And it was really upsetting to see the racial dynamics there. That when a white woman is killed by a black officer, everything, everybody looks, and there's a lot of attention. And she was quickly fired. But what was shocking to me was that how quickly the police department reverted. It really, within months, there were no women in the executive team. Women were diminished. And so that's when I really started to see, like, there is obviously systemic racism throughout police departments. There's no question about that. But there's also systemic sexism. And that systemic sexism also plays a part in the violence that impacts communities of color. So unbelievably, that our story ends with George Floyd's, murder. There's no question. It was a lynching. It was a murder. That even Chief Harteau now says, in retrospect, perhaps some of the reforms that she was hoping to get through were naive. But when do you stop? And I think, it's an interesting moment because there's so much to criticize about the police. And they've done, they're founded on the systemic racism that is our country. And yet there are a few people in there, and there are some women trying to reform it. And I really feel like as we look at reimagining policing, we should be thinking about gender as well. And particularly, and I think it's borne out in the central character in our film, Sergeant Alice White, Black women from the community, and what they bring in their understanding of trauma. It is unbelievable to see an officer who really understands the trauma that Black communities have faced with police, and to be a person who's trying to heal. It's sort of revolutionary. And not that there are some, racist women in police departments, but I think it's something that we should be looking at.
So on that note, I want to turn to you too, Andrea, because you're the executive director of the Georgia affiliate of the ACLU, Go ACLU. And certainly these matters, criminal justice and policing, are issues that you've cared about for a very long time. And these are issues that your affiliate has also addressed. How has the wake of George Floyd's murder affected matters that you work on and are concerned about in Georgia?
Well, of course, like virtually every community of almost any size in the United States, we saw sustained massive protests. And I think that the results and the impact and the awareness that people came to as a result of that sustained effort, we have seen some different people elected to office. But as the ACLU, one of the things that was really heartening is that we had a lot of members who wanted to be supportive of the Black Lives Matter protest. They didn't want to sort of get in front of it. They wanted to be allies. And so we stood up legal observers, across the state, but particularly in Atlanta. When the police started getting very militarized, they started interfering with with groups that were basically peaceful, just because there was a curfew. And so we found that our legal observers, just their presence, kind of helped to calm and kind of keep everybody honest. Um, but when you look at the election results in Georgia, we've had a lot of discussion about, Georgia going for Joe Biden. But the thing that is missing is really an analysis. In Cobb County, we elected a reform sheriff. An African American male was elected sheriff. A Black woman was elected chair of the county commission. In Gwinnett, voters turned out, a sheriff that was anti-immigrant and so forth, and elected a progressive sheriff. In Athens, Clarke County, we elected the first Puerto Rican woman district attorney in the United States. In Savannah, in Augusta, in Douglas County. So, we saw people make the connections that these are elected officials, district attorneys, mayors, we know the mayors are elected officials, but people became aware that district attorneys and sheriffs are elected by the people, and people use their vote to vote. They voted out the district attorney who refused to prosecute the people, the folks who killed Ahmaud Arbery. This woman was voted out of office in a conservative rural county. So voters spoke. And I think that the Black Lives Matter, the sustained protest, really served to educate lots and lots of people about these issues. And I have to say, as someone who comes out of the nonviolent movement, that George Floyd really should have been the person of the year. The the tragedy of his death, but because he died with such dignity, with such restraint, with such, I mean, just totally nonviolent, no violent resistance at all, however, even though it would have been totally justified, that calling out to his mother, that people saw that, and no one could fail to see, the that this was a lynching, and what this meant. And so I think that we are still the reverberations of this movement are going to continue. I think we had a Black woman sheriff elected in DeKalb County. So I think we're going to see tremendous change as a result of this movement, and very important policy change is going to happen as well.
I really appreciate your saying that. So I want to turn to you, Russ and Steve, because what Andrea is saying is that there's some silver linings. In the show, we get to silver linings towards the end of the show, but she's actually suggesting that there were some silver linings that came out of such horrific tragedies that we saw at the beginning of the year. Ahmaud Arbery's death, being tracked down, hunted down, and murdered. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, that this leading to peaceful movements across the United States. And though it didn't get the same national attention, the fact that people responded, even in some conservative communities, to vote out certain people who wield significant authority in the criminal justice realm. So I want to turn to you to talk more about that. There are people who say, yes, but 74 million people voted for Donald Trump. But is there another way to look at this election that picks up on what Andrea has shared with us?
I think there is, Michelle, and looking at the scope of 2020, which isn't quite over, and I think we're ready for it to be over. I was really stunned by the depth of the response to the George Floyd incident. And I think it is not without significance that this occurred in Minneapolis. I am sitting here in the next state over in Wisconsin, amidst all the snow outside. Another one of the major incidents was in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where my sister is a rabbi. These are not places that people have traditionally associated with problems with police. They may think of the South. They may think of racist things in the South. They may think of big cities. It was really galvanizing for, of course, Deidre's film and work on this is about this, to see this problem in places in America where people may not think about it. So that, in my view, created sort of a national perspective on this that was part of the reason that the response was so powerful. The other thing I want to say is, look, this wasn't just in the United States. The response was all over the world. People were talking about George Floyd all over the world. Why is that? It's not because of some great love for the United States or some great hatred for the United States. It's because those people have been subjected to the results of colonialism, just like people in this country. I love our Constitution, but our Constitution reflects colonialism in many ways, in fundamental ways. And so I think this is a moment when the whole world realizes that the legacy of colonialism and imperialism in these situations is still playing out today. Now, on the list, you'll ask for a silver lining, I'll give you that. Okay, so you would expect, and then with my political background, it is very possible when one of these things happens, people take up sides, and you say, whose side are you on? And that's how you vote in the election. And so it's very possible when there's property damage and violence and people say, well, I'm on this side, so I'm going to vote this way. It was close, but that's not what happened in Wisconsin. Even after that Kenosha incident where Trump ran right into Wisconsin as fast as he could, tried to try to exploit what happened in Kenosha, and then Biden came and of course was much calmer about it. Biden still won. People did not go to the racist corner. And that to me is definitely a silver lining that is only a small addition to the excellent examples that Andrea gave.
Steve, what's your take on these issues in Texas, a place that the nation turns its eyes to?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a little more circumspect, not because I haven't been heartened by all of the developments that Deirdre and Andrea and Russ pointed to, but because, here in Texas, I mean, even though we are a pretty purple state, we have a deep red state legislature, we have a deep red state government, neither of which are interested in almost any of these things. And even when, local jurisdictions try to make progress, the response is often for the state to come in and actually pass laws that disempower those local jurisdictions, like here in Travis County and city of Austin, from doing that. But the other thing I was going to say, Michelle, is I was more optimistic as recently as the last time, you and I spoke, that all of this momentum coming out of the summer would actually translate into some kind of nationwide policy reform. We had Congress for the first time really ever having a serious conversation about qualified immunity. We had Congress, considering a whole bunch of legislative proposals that would have made it at least easier to hold even local law enforcement officers accountable. And that all died, at least, as a matter of public attention as we went into the election. I think it probably died as a matter of policy, almost no matter what happens in the Georgia runoffs, on January 5th. And so I think, the question is, how do we keep the momentum and how do we keep the pressure up so that it's not just the grassroots efforts on the ground that Deirdre and Andrea were talking about that are, responsible for reforms, but so that there's actually some leadership at the federal level. And in that regard, I mean, the thing that I was actually most heartened by in all of these developments was just how much energy and effort and frankly money that we saw professional athletes putting into these topics. I mean, I think, when we look back at the summer of 2020 and all of these issues, the sort of, the shattering of the glass, the breaking of the taboo, the era of Michael Jordan saying Republicans buy sneakers too. That seems to be over now. And I think it's really important that folks in these communities who tend to be marginalized politically actually use the clear power they have. And we've seen that. And so I hope that becomes one of the hallmarks of the positives that come out of this very tragic, very fraught series of social events.
Steve, I'm so glad that you brought that up because it says a lot about whose messaging matters, how we understand facts altogether, right? Because many of these athletes, they play their profession is in these very spaces where Russ said people don't really think about Minneapolis. They don't think about Kenosha. These athletes do, right? In Wisconsin, there have been Milwaukee Bucks basketball players who have been arrested while going to their car in parking lots. That, the same has been true across the country, that these athletes walk a very fine line. On one hand, they're highly celebrated. Clearly fans know what they look like, but sometimes police officers clearly do not. And so they walk that racial line. So I want to actually turn to that communicating, because we see now folks are not just relying on news. News itself has become a bit compromised. And you have this messaging coming from athletes of all people and others. So what do we take of that, right? I know you weren't necessarily prepared for that question, but Steve opened it up, right? Who do people listen to now? How do we understand Fox News? Understand news is at all?
But also the role that the players had was quite material. I mean, in Atlanta, the Hawks, the coach of the Hawks, led an effort that the Hawks Stadium was a early voting site. And that inspired all of the arenas. to be made available during early voting, which made for safer voting, right? It's more easily to be socially distant. There's not, we had a new stadium, so it's kind of like, hey, this is cool. I haven't actually seen it, so I'll go vote here. And we also did, the multiple recounts that happened in the state of Georgia. They also made the arena available so that people could do a safe recount, socially distant recount. So they had a very concrete impact on people's ability in a lot of these urban centers to vote and vote safely despite the COVID epidemic. And of course, the big stand up was the Atlanta Dream, who support Raphael Warnock against the owner of their team, Kelly
And I was
Loeffler.
Look at that. Yeah, Steve, add to that.
all I was gonna say was, I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing is, the old sort of mantra, keep the politics out of my sports. I mean, the reality is, I think more and more Americans are coming to appreciate that politics are everywhere. Not partisanship, right? I mean, that there's a difference between partisanship and politics, but that politics are everywhere. And I don't know if it's that COVID drove that home even before George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all of those tragic episodes as well. But, much like when Hurricane Katrina, took the bloom off the rose of the Bush administration in 2005, I think
Quotable, so
right.
quotable, Steve. Bloom off the
Well,
rose.
I think that this year has been a cascading series of events that have driven home to Americans in ways that many of us either might have been too privileged to appreciate previously or just too lucky to appreciate previously, that all politics is local. And that what that means in reality is that the leaders of our community are not necessarily the elected officials, but the ones who actually have the energy, the network, the time, and in some cases the money. So when LeBron says something, people listen. Right, when the Atlanta Dream wear T-shirts protesting their own owner, that's a national story. And I think it's really, really important that we capitalize upon this understanding, because I think one of the apathy of Americans politically, I think, has been one of the problems of how we got here. And so if one of the things that comes out of 2020 is that more Americans are paying more attention, that's not ideal if what they're paying attention to are right-wing conspiracy theory media outlets that don't tell the truth, but at least they're paying attention to something. And that, I'll take that over apathy.
All right, so how do we reconcile this conversation with Colin Kaepernick? Yeah, didn't know that we were going to turn into a sports show. We will for just a moment, right? Because Colin Kaepernick said, take a knee for this, right? Was it just that, and this is really sad. It makes me think about the work you're doing, Deidre, and the work that you're doing, Andrea. Does Black death, right? Does it take Black people dying, people of color dying in the streets in order for then there to be a kind of momentum that then allows athletes to just stand up, as we've seen in the last couple of years? Because it's not as if Muhammad Ali didn't do it. It's not as if Colin Kaepernick didn't take a knee. What's been the difference?
Well, I think Donald Trump is certainly one of the differences, right? I mean, I started the ACLU in January of 2017. And the shocks started coming immediately. I mean, one of my, I think it was the weekend after the Trump inaugural when, the Muslim ban was implemented. And so people, you had the Women's March and then the demonstrations that started because of the Muslim ban. And so, we were out at the airport, and people with signs, Mexicans for Muslims, and and my favorite, the ACLU is one with me, and I'm one with the ACLU, and it's just been like that for 4 years. And so I think people do understand, every group who thought, what, I can just do my job and stay out of this politics thing, started getting attacked, and so we were living that. That quote from the Nazi era is that, they came for the trade unionists and I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't speak up. And then by the time they got to be, there was no one to speak for me, right? And so I think people really started coming together. And I think that's, so the sheriff, the same sheriff who was defeated in Cobb County was someone who criticized and said that the Black cheerleaders at Kennesaw State University, also in Cobb County, should have been expelled for taking a knee. Um, and so I think people remembered. And so I think it's been a process. These 4 years have really been a process that government matters, who's in office matters, policy matters, and that people's lives are really impacted in very material ways by who our elected officials are.
So, Deidre, I want to turn to you because I'd like to see you map out in many ways Andrea's mapping at the ACLU because you started Women in Blue in 2017. Is that right? And then it ends with George. What's the difference between when you first went in and what you saw versus what you come out with now? And by the way, we're just weeks away before the film comes out on February the 8th. But tell us about what that difference in time meant. And then we're going to turn to this election.
Well, that's such a complicated because there were so many things going on in Minneapolis. But, I think that, look, there was police violence and systemic racism in Minneapolis way before George Floyd was murdered. Low-level offenses. A black person was 8.5 times more likely. That is actually from the ACLU to be arrested than a white person. They call it Minnesota nice, but really it is one of the worst places to be a black person raising a family.
And just for clarification, what you were saying is that a black person was 8.5 times more likely to be arrested for doing the same things that white people
right,
did.
Absolutely. Right? Low-level offenses, and I think that's where you really. I think there were a lot of issues, and I know there's a activist in our film who's been fighting for police reform for the last 5 years, Nakima Levy Armstrong, and she said to me, why did it take George Floyd's murder to wake people up? Why did it take that? And what I want to say is, I don't know, but I do think it woke a lot of people up to things that were happening. It's just. What would have happened if that brave young woman, I'm forgetting her name, hadn't filmed that, and the courage that she had to do that. I just think that a lot of things, and my parents are from Nazi Germany. So the second that Trump went in, I turned to my partner and I said, at what point do we leave the country? I think that fear that people start to wake up and go like, wait, what is our country? What is it supposed to be doing? And oh my God, we're moving towards fascism. But underneath that, I think that for me, I have to say, it's been a real wake up call. The whole New York Times 1619 Project, our country is founded on racist patriarchy. I really liked what Russ was saying. It's, colonialism is in our Constitution. And the first election that I had was Carter against Reagan. And I have seen the world change so much. Then you look and you go, yeah, it really was different in the 70s. We were moving a certain way. We were saying incarceration doesn't work. And look where we are now. So I really agree. The question is, how do we keep the momentum up? But also, I think, how do we have the hard conversations, right? So for me, I'm really interested right now in, can we have Black Lives Matter have a conversation about what women could bring to policing, and not as a way of defending the current system, but just having open conversations about what is going to help us move to a more humane society, equitable society for all of us. So I do think it's an exciting time. I don't, as horrible as it's been, I don't see the same kind of energy and and people rising up that I've seen since, I was a teenager.
Steve, you're going to add to that.
To me, I think the question is how much of what was unique about this year's reaction was COVID, right? Where folks who have been able to live in bubbles of entitlement, and I count myself among them, right? Were, confronted with disruptions of their lives that so many Americans suffer on a far more regular basis, but just aren't often felt by the folks who tend to have more influence politically and economically, right? And so I think this is the challenge going forward, which is if this really was a result of a unique confluence of events, not just all of the tragic episodes that we know so well, but also the fact that people were, locked in their homes in ways that were disrupting their own existence to, different but perhaps empathetically relatable degrees. I don't know how you capitalize upon that going forward. I mean, the hope is that actually, I hope that part at least is changing. And so the question is, like, in 18 months when things are, quote, back to normal, unquote, at least as a public health matter, how do we make sure that we haven't lost the thread? And I think that's where it's incumbent upon not just folks like, the five of us, but our political leaders, the athletes, the folks who really do have voice in these communities to keep the pressure up. That's why, the one sort of discordant note I think I've struck so far in this conversation is just how disappointed I am that this conversation didn't go further, at least on Capitol Hill.
Okay, if I could follow on that, and picking
Go
up
right ahead, Russ. Yes.
to the phrase, thanks, Michelle, on back to normal. I think that's exactly the problem. And it's not just back to normal, which of course is what everybody's dying for all over the world. It's back to normal in our political system after we've had an insane president, an attack on the rule of law. So the mantra, the feeling is, can't we go back to normal? The problem is, though, what is normal when you talk about police practices and racism? If we go back to that normal, we have not done the right thing.
What's normal in terms of who gets to be elected, right? Felony disenfranchisement.
And these things aren't solved, as Steve's pointing out. So here's the problem. Everybody is going to be, well, can't we just, have a good life now and return to a good life? And people start bringing up these tragic realities of racial injustice in our country. A lot of people are going to say, come on, do we have to go back to that? Well, we have to go back to it. It hasn't been resolved, but there is going to be the most enormous desire to just have things be calm and not controversial that you've ever seen, for the reasons that Steve just articulated, in addition to the other thing.
So then what does a 2020 election and the Biden-Harris win mean for our democracy? A lot of people think that it might change things, and to your point, Russ, restore, but as you've said, restore to what? Andrea, I'm going to turn to you.
Well, it means we continue to have one, which I think in the aftermath of the November 3rd election, and the continuing behavior of many of people who swore to uphold the Constitution, it does mean we continue for now. We continue to have a democracy, which was very much, I think, would have been in question if I never thought Georgia would be a factor in this election. And understand the that how valiant these Republican office holders have been. We're trying to say, well, what's the difference? So traditionally, voter suppression happens before people cast their ballots, and that kind of voter suppression is very acceptable among Southern Republican office holders. They actually drew the line at throwing away ballots that had already been voted. The idea that you are a hero because you refuse to throw away legally cast ballots, which is what Lindsey Graham asked our Secretary of State to do, which is what the president probably asked, office holders in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan to do, is just breathtaking. But that's where we are among people who took an oath to uphold the Constitution, that they would put this kind of pressure on office holders. So, so I think that's what it means. We continue to have a democracy. I think the presidency has tremendous powers, as we saw. One of the things will be to rehabilitate things like the Justice Department. Rehabilitate these institutions of our government, but we don't want it built back the same way. I mean, the ACLU, we sued Obama, we sued Trump, we'll sue Biden and Harris, right? And because we are working toward a more perfect union. And I think that the thing we do know, and the thing that has happened while people were at home during COVID and watching some of these videos over and over, is you can't pretend you don't know now. And so we do know. If I say, if you want to know what structural racism looks like, look at the COVID epidemic. Black people are dying of COVID because we are exposed to COVID, because of the jobs we do, because of the lack of access to health care, especially in the southern states. And so the scourge of COVID tracks the scourge of racism in this country. So I think we have, people can't unsee, they can't unknow what they've learned this year. And hopefully that'll give us some leverage to keep pressing for the kind of change that we need to have a society based on, racial justice and democratic principles.
Steve, what's your sense of what this 2020 election, the Biden-Harris win, means for our democracy, especially in the light of all of the challenges that took place even after the election? It was like an election period that wouldn't end.
Yeah, I mean, Michelle, this to me is the real question, which is, what are the lessons we're going to take away from the 6 weeks after Election Day, where for the first time, certainly in modern American history, right? Election Day was like the opening act. And the next 6 weeks were like, okay, different efforts to overturn the clear result of the election. Now we're going to try this one. Now we're going to try this one. Now we're going to try. It's clear that those efforts have failed. It's clear to me that January 6th, the joint session of Congress is going to confirm that Biden and Harris are the president-elect, and they'll be sworn in on January 20th. My question is, what happens next time? And so when we're thinking about, our democracy and the health of our democracy, man, 2020 to me has underscored the fragility of our democracy. I mean, imagine right now if Republicans had actually won 10 more seats in the House, and we're going to have a majority of the House come January 6th. I think there'd be a lot more concern that, Republican majorities in the House and the Senate would just disqualify Biden electors for no good reason. From enough states where at least the election would go to the House and then the Republicans could elect Trump that way. That's a terrifying prospect for a democracy. And so, Michelle, one of the things that I worry about is how do we try to prevent this from happening when it's even closer next time, if it's even closer next time. And that to me, unfortunately, is going to require Congress.
So what about those who might push back, Steve, right? So when you think about Republican, right? So one could say, Justice Blackmun was Republican appointed. He wrote the opinion in Roe v. Wade, and it's a great opinion as he talks about the importance of women being able to set their own destinies and futures in education and employment. It's a 7-2 decision. 5 of those 7 were Republican appointed. Or you think about Richard Nixon and the founding of the EPA, or signing legislation into law that Title 10, providing reproductive health care to the poorest of Americans. What's the difference between those Republicans? Those were Republicans, right? Prescott Bush was the treasurer of Planned Parenthood. That's George H.W. Bush's father. What's the difference between then and now?
They're not the same party. I mean, I'm not sure Richard Nixon could win a Republican primary today.
Ronald Reagan couldn't win a Republican.
I mean and I think I think Andrew is right on that. And so I am not the right person to comment on the health and future of the Republican Party, but I think it has become clear over the last 2 years, especially, that Trump is not the disease. Trump was a symptom. And that there is a authoritarian, incredibly sort of nationalistic sentiment within the Republican Party that is not limited to Donald Trump. And so when I try to think about we hear lots of stories about how the Biden administration is trying to look across the aisle to forge bipartisan consensus, and my question is, who's there? Who are the Republican leaders right now who actually have it for whom it actually makes any sense to try to moderate their views and compromise? I mean, look at the lawsuit Texas filed against Pennsylvania, this preposterous invocation of the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction to try to throw out the election. 65% of the House Republican caucus, filed an amicus brief in support of that lawsuit. So
yeah, 126 of them, I think, signed
right.
it. Yeah.
So I guess, Michelle, to me, the part of the problem here is that, I would love a scenario where you had a moderate Democratic president like Joe Biden in a position to actually build bridges with at least some moderate Republicans and get us back to a point where not everything is tribal. I just, the events of the last couple of years, and especially the last 6 weeks, have not given us a whole lot of reason to believe that that's likely in the offing.
Andrea, I know that you wanted to jump in there. Then I want to turn to you, Russ, because you're a senator. You were there, and I'd love to get your take. So Andrea, what are you thinking?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, Georgia was one of the states that was sued by Texas, and Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue supported that lawsuit, and four members of the Georgia congressional delegation supported the lawsuit
To throw out their own elections.
to throw out their own election, which they want. I mean, David Perdue was actually the number, actually got more votes. It's just that they have this weird rule about runoff. So it's bizarre. But the Republican Party has become a far right party. If you look at global standards of sort of where, the Democrats have not really moved. It's the Republicans that have moved further and further to the right, to where, they really are. I mean, the fascist tendencies that we're seeing right now, are quite real.
So when you're talking about then what we've seen, kids in cages and the ACLU being appointed, designated by a judge to find the parents of kids who were separated, which is pretty outstanding if you think about it, a civil society organization being put in charge of doing something such as that because of concern about whether the Trump administration could actually carry through. And many of the other things that we've seen come about in the last 4 years, Muslim bans, the kind of racist sentiments coming from the White House with regard to people from South and Central America and Mexico and so much more. I think that that's part of what you're speaking about there. Russ, inside baseball, you've been there. So what's the difference? Do you see a difference between those folks who were your colleagues, both as a state senator in Wisconsin, and then also for the United States Senate?
Well, Michelle, it is dramatically different than the world that I served in, both in the state Senate and the U.S. Senate. What I remember is when I first started running for the state Senate here in Middleton, Wisconsin in 1982, I would knock on people's doors in the Democrat area, the Republican areas. It was a very Republican district. And I found out right away that if I started saying something about Democrats are better because of this or so on, people would say, well, we don't really want to hear that. We want to hear your ideas. So the highest form for a Wisconsin politician was to be perceived as an independent and as somebody that could work with the other side. Of course, I tried to live up to that and was able to with John McCain, where we were able to pass probably the best known bipartisan bill of the last 50 years. People loved it. And something, people think, well, moderates should come together. I wasn't a moderate, I was on the left. And John was a conservative. It's not coming together in the middle. It's people who may be on two different extremes saying, you know what, I agree with you.
Tell us about that legislation.
Well, this was our bill to prohibit abuses in the campaign finance system, the soft money ban. One of the great myths in America is that Citizens United decision overturned McCain-Feingold. It did not. It just destroyed everything else so that we don't have a real campaign finance system. But that took 8 years. But it was fantastic. And the technique that we used was, it was like the Noah's Ark. The animals go 2 by 2. If you brought in a Republican co-sponsor, you had to have a Democrat join too. So people only joined our coalition. And once we had 10 senators, we controlled the Senate. They couldn't do anything if we would object. So somehow, and this is where Steve's words are and others, really concern me, is I don't know if that's still possible with these folks. So back in 2009, I remember that my town meetings were getting very contentious as the Tea Party came up. And somebody started attacking me on the climate change issue. And I said, look, I'm co-sponsoring, John Kerry's co-sponsoring a bill with Lindsey Graham on climate change. And they started screaming, oh, he's just a rhino, a Republican in name only. And so, Michelle, the answer is this. What politicians want more than anything else is to stay in office. And so if their greatest fear is a primary from the right, that drives everything. These people hate Donald Trump. Most of these senators, they know he's.
It doesn't seem so. So this is the thing, to the public, it seems like they love him.
No, well, I'm talking about the senators now.
I know, but I think the people think that the senators love him.
I think most of them don't. I think most of them are basically people who are gentlemen and gentlewomen who find this offensive, but they don't want to lose their jobs. So people like Lindsey Graham shame themselves by kowtowing to somebody that, frankly, John McCain's best friend knows that Donald Trump is despicable, but he'll play golf with him as often as he needs to in order to make sure he doesn't get a primary in South Carolina. That's the bottom line.
All right. So then I want to turn to what happened after the election, right? Because as you said, Steve, this has just been a slow roll. We thought that it would have been over that first Tuesday in November, and it hasn't been because there's been so much litigation. And you've been at the forefront of articulating about this, analyzing it, about this. So give us the rundown. What happened after the election? What do our listeners need to know?
I mean, I think that the craziest thing to me, Michelle, is that from, I guess it was Saturday, November 7th, right, when all the major media networks called the election for, President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris. In any other election year, that would have been it. And that night, the candidate who lost would have given a gracious concession speech, and the transition would have started, if not that night, Monday morning.
And we know in the past, Republicans have given great concession speeches, right?
I mean,
so that's not that they haven't.
Senator McCain in 2008, I think, was a model of not just a great concession speech, but a unifying concession speech, and legitimizing the election of the country's first Black president. I mean, I think he understood the importance of doing that. And of course, when we have a crybaby in the White House, it's not quite the same thing. And so what's happened is, with the president's support, and in some cases at his direction, Trump surrogates and Trump enablers, and in some cases the Trump campaign, have brought every conceivable lawsuit, and even some inconceivable ones, based on this narrative of fraud and misconduct that they have been woefully unable to substantiate in court. And so, depending upon how you count, there have been somewhere north of 65 separate lawsuits filed in state and federal court.
All right, let's just repeat that. Sometimes I like doing that. You said north of 65 lawsuits challenging the election results.
And, and folks say, well, what about 2000 Bush versus Gore? And, yes, Bush versus Gore was a, election that largely turned on a lawsuit. But let's talk about what happened in 2000, right? You had one state. The whole election came down to one state. It came down to a state that was by any measure statistically tied, where, the final margin between the two candidates was 537 votes out of, 4 or 5 million votes overall. And so, it's inevitable when you have one state that is that close that there's going to be litigation. I know Russ has some experience with this in Wisconsin politics. There was a recount in, I think, one of Governor Walker's races one year, right? That when you have one election that comes down to a couple of hundred votes, yes, you're going to have some litigation play out. It's unprecedented that you had, Biden winning by far more than one state. I mean, by 4, 5, 6 states, depending upon how you count, where in the closest of those states, the margin was still 5 figures, and yet we have all this, litigation. And one of the things that we saw in the litigation, Michelle, is that what the president and his allies were saying publicly was not what they were alleging in court. Publicly they're saying there's fraud, Dominion machines, there's all this bad stuff happened. But when they actually have to file, legal documents under penalty of perjury, their claims
with
are
all sorts of typos.
Well,
let me digress.
They haven't been good at it, but just on the merits. I mean, yes, it's fun to dunk on them for being incompetent, but competence aside, right? The substance of the claims is invariably either small potato stuff, where maybe like 25 ballots that were counted shouldn't have been, or the entire election was unconstitutional stuff, like in Pennsylvania, where they have this frontal assault on mail-in voting, which the Republican-led legislature, approved in 2019. So, we've had this remarkable sort of idea that litigation is where all this process should play out, even though the election wasn't close and didn't come down to one state. And as we've seen, the litigation has been a spectacular failure, where the only case that the president and his supporters won was a case about curing mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania, where the state court had said where the Secretary of State had said we can extend the deadline for curing a defective ballot by showing a proper ID by 3 days. That got thrown out to the expense of maybe a couple of hundred ballots, and that's been it.
And still Biden won there. Andrea, you wanted to jump in there, and of course, Georgia now, the nation's eyes are on Georgia and the election there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I don't think we can say enough. Steve's point about the things that were said in the press were not said in court, because the things said in the press were not true. And if you lie in court, you can get disbarred. And so so essentially, even what they alleged in the official pleadings was not something that, had they proven it, would have gotten them the relief that they were asking for. So they, just this last weekend, they tried to stop the Georgia electors. So all the the electors voted on Monday, and so they had a last minute effort after they lost in the U.S. Supreme Court to try to come into the Georgia Supreme Court, and the Georgia Supreme Court said this has no merit. So people need to, and so I think it's really important that people who keep saying, well, these Republican controlled state, I mean, the state Supreme Court in Georgia is controlled by Republicans. The Secretary of State is an elected Republican. The governor is an elected Republican. The Attorney General the Republicans control both houses of the legislature, and no one is affirming that there was anything wrong with Georgia's election. And Georgia's election is run by 159 boards of elections, which is insane. But it means that there is no way you can mount a systematic, it's just it. But the fact that people would persist, and that's another legacy of the Trump administration, is the lying. Is part of the problem about kids in cages, was that then they lied about it. They tried to prevent members of Congress from touring the facilities, the concealment, refusing to have people come before Congress and testify about what they are doing as people who are administering the people's business. So that the concealment, the lying, the resistance to the and so we see this playing out continually, that they continue to just lie about what happened in this election, where, as you said, even in the state of Georgia, 3 recounts, a 12,000 vote margin for Joe Biden.
And Russ, on that point, at the same time, while those efforts were taking place very recently over the weekend in Georgia, the same was taking place in Wisconsin, right? So in Wisconsin, there were challenges to the election that were taking place prior to the electors coming together and finally saying yes, and Joe Biden has secured this victory. What took place in Wisconsin?
Well, it's both a horror and a ray of hope. The bottom line is good, but we have 3 of 7 justices who basically were open to the most outrageous arguments that Steve was talking about. And had it not been for the fact that the 4th conservative justice, there are currently 4 conservatives and 3 liberals, has, for whatever reason, and he's a hardline conservative, in the last few months has been voting with the 3 liberals on these issues. And he's been following the law in what I consider to be a profile in courage. Justice Hagedorn, I campaigned against him. I tried to defeat him. I definitely didn't want him to win, but he is modeling the idea of somebody who is actually a justice on our Supreme Court. And he shut this thing down. He's going to get a rough time from the right wingers. But it's that kind of moment when people say, oh, wait a minute, why would somebody do that? Well, he actually believes in the rule of law. He drove Democrats crazy. He was the legal counsel for Scott Walker, a governor that most people couldn't stand. And yet he has enough of a core. And I hope that will be something that people across the country will realize. Of course, you have people in Georgia, Andrea, public officials who have shown that similar courage. But, it was shut down. And it's a wonderful precedent with regard to our Supreme Court, which the reputation of which used to be one of the best courts in the country. Its reputation has been terribly tarnished But this is an upbeat moment, and it was in the name of protecting our electoral system and our legal system.
It's interesting that you should say that in terms of how the Wisconsin Supreme Court was viewed, because as Andrea mentioned, this we've seen in the last few years a real attack on our constitutional democracy, who we are, this assault on our Constitution over the last few years. And this matters to our communities. This matters in society. I wish that we had even more time to unpack these issues, but we're turning to the end of our show. And for the end of our show, I love it if you could give some sense of what you think of as coming next. I'm mindful of the pessimism or the realism that Steve brings to this. And I think that it's important to be measured. But what do you see as silver linings coming forward? And of the things that we've seen over the last year, we see the election of Biden Harris. Harris will be the first woman vice president in the United States, woman of color, African-American woman, and woman of South Asian descent. And there's much more. So let me turn to you first, Deidre. What do you see as a silver lining coming forward as we leave 2020 and climb into 2021?
Well, I mean, certainly the vaccines are incredibly hopeful, although tragic that so many people are going to die before we get there to all have it. But the vaccine, but I mean, I think, I am the child of people who left Nazi Germany, and I was very, very scared that we were going to lose our democracy. It seemed, and I'd certainly agree with Andrea, that everything that Trump has done afterwards makes it clear that had he won, we would have lost all sorts of sense of this sort of legal framework. I'm not a lawyer, but I have grown to revere your profession because I feel like those checks and balances held up in ways that have fortified, that I was more, even though it's been tragic to see it play out, and 65 just seems like lunacy, like, frivolous suits. But it's also made me kind of believe in some level in the system. And so for me, the other silver lining is that I think that we as a country really get systemic racism, not everybody, but more people. And I hope that that consciousness grows, and economic justice and racial justice. I heard this crazy statistics the other day that 1 out of 8 children don't get enough food. And so there's a lot to be pessimistic about, but I think the inequities in our society, both racial and economic, there's been a light, and that they're in the forefront. And I do feel hopeful. And I see the people around me ready to, roll up their sleeves. So I think there's so much work to be done, but I think that we've had a reprieve from something that could have been disastrous and dark.
What about you, Russ?
Well, I am hopeful that having a mature, decent man be president will model a behavior, especially for young people, that is the opposite of the horrific model that Donald Trump was. I mean, it really does go to the young people. If I had been brought up to believe that you always have to, sort of try to model what the president did, and the president was Trump, I'd be a very different person. And so, instead of somebody that sort of tells the Proud Boys to stand by, we would have a president who says, this is wrong. And what happened in Washington this past few days with the Proud Boys and with the attack on the church there, I think moral suasion can cause people to say, as we return to normal, and we've already talked about returning to normal isn't all good, but returning to the normal of not believing in violence and taking the most extreme step, I think that this can be a period where people actually say, you know what, we don't want to go back to that. And that requires moral suasion from the top of the country all the way down.
Andrea, what do you see as a silver lining coming forward?
Well, the results of what happened in Georgia are the results of, 4 years of the ACLU just relentlessly pushing back against voter suppression, and, work on the ground of dozens of organizations. And what we see is that the first day of early voting for the Senate runoff, more people voted than voted the first day of the general election. So people have gotten the message that votes matter, that when they vote, they can win. And, we had a slogan, the ACLU Southern affiliates, hope, vote, advocate. This is a nonstop cycle, right? It does not end. You hope it's what you hope for. You have to vote for it. You have to advocate for it. And so, I believe that, this election, people are going to turn up and vote their conscience and vote for the principles that are important to them. And then we're going to go in the legislature and advocate for policies that reflect those. And we're going to, and, rinse, wash, and repeat. And we're just going to keep doing that until we have the society that's worthy of Martin Luther King and Jimmy Carter and the ideals of our Constitution and the best freedom fighters that have stood for justice throughout our history.
That's right. And thinking about Congressman John Lewis and his passing this year, we certainly have a beacon to live up to and not just look up to. And Steve, I'll close out with you, you mighty election warrior, you. So what's the silver lining coming ahead in 2021?
About a year ago, there was a meme going around on Twitter, right? 2019 in 5 words. And so my response to that meme was 2020 will be worse. And unfortunately that tweet aged well. The silver lining, Michelle, is that 2021 is going to be better. And it's going to be better along any number of axes. Deirdre pointed out vaccines. I mean, we can't ignore that, the lead story of 2020 is that over 300,000 Americans died in a pandemic that was not avoidable, but that the effects of which could surely have been far better mitigated by an effective federal response. That number hopefully will not be nearly as tragic in 2021. Russ, I think, is exactly right about what it's going to mean to have stable, competent leadership in the White House, as of January 20th. Andrea, I think, is exactly right about the impact on the ground. So I guess, we have a long way to go. And we have revealed a heck of a lot of things that need to be fixed. But, I feel much more optimistic that we have a chance to fix them going into 2021 than I felt this time a year ago. And I think that's something that the key is just not to waste the opportunity.
Yes, and listeners, that's it for today's episode of On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin. I want to thank my guests, Russ Feingold, Deidre Fishel, Stephen Vladeck, and Andrea Young for joining us and being part of this critical and insightful conversation. And to our listeners, I thank you for tuning in for the full story. We hope you join us again for our next episode where we will be reporting, rebelling, and telling it like it is with special guests tackling issues related to the new Congress. We want you to meet the new feminist in Congress. We'll be joined by Rep-elect Carolyn Bordeaux, Rep-elect Teresa Leger-Fernandez, Rep-elect Marie Newman, and Rep-elect Nikema Williams. It will be an episode you will not want to miss. For more information on what we discussed today, please head to MsMagazine.com. And if you believe, as we do, that women's voices matter, that equality for all persons cannot be delayed, and that rebuilding America, being unbought and unbossed, and reclaiming our time are important, then be sure to visit us at Apple Podcasts. Look for us at MsMagazine.com for new content and special episode updates. Rate and subscribe to On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, and Stitcher. Let us know what you think about our show and support independent feminist media. This has been your host, Michelle Goodwin, reporting, rebelling, and telling it like it is. On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin is a Ms. Magazine joint production. Kathy Spiller and Michelle Goodwin are our executive producers. Our producers for this episode are Maddie Ponce, Roxy Zoll, and Mariah Lindsay. The creative vision behind our work includes art and design by Brandy Phipps, editing by Will Alvarez and Marsh Allen, and music by Chris J. Lee. Stephanie Wilner provides executive assistance.